Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we examine the long-term economic consequences of COVID. Much economic study has been focused on the dramatic acute impact of the pandemic. The collapse in world trade and GDP, followed by a strong recovery in many economies, and the continuing struggle of many administrations to balance health priorities with sustaining economic activity. Given the mixed results, much work to produce better policy outcomes remains to be done. However, two economists on either side of the planet have also been focusing on the longer-term human economics of COVID. Today, we examine the work of New Zealand economist Dr. Richard Meade and Professor David Blanchflower of Dartmouth College in the United States. Richard Meade is a research fellow in economics at Auckland University of Technology and principal economist of Cognitus Economic Insight. He's brought forward a policy initiative of COVID family loans, which it is argued will be more beneficial and affordable than short-term labour subsidies. It might be a promising alternative to the Chancellor of the Exchequer cutting benefits for the poorest people in the land. He's in conversation with Alex.
Dr. Richard Meade, thank you so much for joining me in the Alex Salmond Show from Auckland in New Zealand.
Thanks very much. Nice to be here, Alex.
Dr. Meade, a lot of the economic analysis of the pandemic is focused on the acute phase, the sharp fall in world GDP, the sharp recovery in many countries. But do you think that the longer-term effects may concentrate on what's called long COVID, the long debilitating condition that many people are suffering from?
I think it's obviously early days in the sense that we don't yet know what long COVID really is going to be looking like longer term, but it's certainly giving us indications that it could be something that has a very long tail and it could affect a great proportion of the population, especially the younger parts of the population, and this could have a very enduring economic cost.
Is there any similar disease which has that debilitating effect in a significant quantity that has been measured? Is there some comparative we can have with other conditions?
I could speak to my own personal experience in the sense that I had chronic fatigue syndrome, or otherwise known as ME, or myalgic encephalomyelitis, for 11 years. And happily that resolved some years ago. But when I started first reading about long COVID and the sorts of symptoms that the sufferers of long COVID are having to put up with, it gave me a rather nasty sense of deja vu. And it made me think that even if these conditions are not identical or not even in the same sort of ballpark, if long COVID is anything like chronic fatigue syndrome, it could have very potentially long consequences for the people who suffer it, by which I mean they could be decades of their lives suffering serious debilitation. And even worse, it seems, with long COVID, there's measurable organ damage, and that could lead to premature death.
And of course, the numbers that we are being estimated for long COVID for those countries which have had a large rate of infection, like the UK for that matter, are perhaps 10 times those who've been severely affected in the acute phase. That added together could be a huge economic effect over the long term.
I agree. So I think, just running numbers, you'd say a certain number of people die from COVID, and that's obviously very bad and it's very costly, and it's something we should be paying very much attention to. But statistically speaking, you can imagine a great many more people, in fact, might not even go to hospital with COVID, but suffer from the illness and then end up with an enduring illness. And even if not all of that cohort end up having long COVID for a very long time, already indications, even from the UK, where you have something like almost 400,000 people that have had long COVID for more than 1 year, there's some chance that will mean there are people that end up potentially many years, possibly decades, if the experience of sufferers of chronic fatigue syndrome, for example, is anything to go by. And so if we extrapolate across the rest of the UK and across the rest of the pandemic, if we extrapolate across the rest of the world, we can see that there's going to be quite a few people, in fact, that will be affected by this. And some proportion of that cohort could end up very unwell for a very long time.
And let's have a look at the comparative effect. I mean, you're speaking to us from New Zealand, where a country which famously has gone for an elimination strategy, and other countries have done the same. Hong Kong would be an example. Many countries in Asia have fairly successfully to date pursued very low rates of COVID. But other countries have been letting COVID effectively spread through the community. Suppression, certainly, but not elimination. Is there going to be a comparative effect of those economies which have successfully eliminated or kept COVID to very low levels, and those who, on the basis that the acute phase doesn't seem to be killing too many people, have let it spread through the economy. You know, the countries which have taken the big effort of elimination, they're going to be the gainers in the longer term.
I think we certainly hope so, you know, speaking from New Zealand, obviously, but I think there is a genuine issue for the countries that have allowed the virus to become more endemic, that even if the mortality rate is falling because the vaccination rates are taking off, we should be very mindful of the fact that there's more than one way to create an economic cost from the pandemic. And chronic illness, if that's debilitating and it's stopping people from living their normal lives, from working their normal jobs, etc., that's actually a very costly thing. And so if we think about the overall economic cost of the pandemic, we can think about the human cost and loss of life and the GDP impacts of whatever measure we put in place to try and stop the virus from spreading. But we do need to be very mindful also of these other enduring possible health consequences.
How exactly do you measure the impact of somebody suffering a debilitating illness against somebody, well, effectively who dies in a short period of time?
This is where I'd speak to it as a qualified economist who dabbles from time to time in health economics, but I'm not a specialist health economist. So as someone who strays into their territory, I'd say that there are measures used, things like quality adjusted life years and disability adjusted life years, which are measures that health economists around the world use to get a sense of how you can compare different kinds of illnesses and death, you know, literally. And because economists are cold-blooded and we don't get invited to parties, we put a dollar value on these things. We say that effectively, you know, losing a certain number of life years altogether has a certain price. And even if people don't lose their life per se, but they lose the quality adjusted life years because they suffer some sort of debilitation, for example, we put a price on that too. And we only do it because we have to figure out how to ration resources, obviously. We need to figure out what's the best way to use the finite resources we have to get the most benefit for society. And if that requires these sorts of cold-blooded assessments, it's just something we have to, you know, do with the best we possibly can.
Well, we shouldn't shoot the messenger because we're practitioners of the dismal science, I suppose. But in terms of policy impact, I mean, policy makers will have to make adjustments to social security policy, to health at work policy as a result of long COVID. They're going to be, if we're talking about the numbers which seem to be the case in those countries, even high vaccinated countries, with a large element of long COVID being measured in the population, there's going to be a huge shift in policy to accommodate the impact of that.
I think that's right. And you're actually pointing to a whole layer of additional costs that aren't often even factored into these sorts of analyses. Having suffered chronic fatigue syndrome, it's not like there are that many actual treatments you might do. And so you could say that's not very costly. It's very costly to the people who don't get the treatment, obviously, but it's not very costly to the system. I'm hopeful. I'd like to think that because COVID is so widespread and this long COVID condition could be such a pressing issue, we will get some very serious medical research. In the same way we dedicated the research to developing vaccines, we should be dedicating some very serious research to making sure we can come up with some sort of decent answer to fixing long COVID rather than just leaving it as one of those conditions people have to live with.
Dr. Meade, we've had public health officials, doctors on the show from New Zealand who've effectively been saying to, you know, what on earth are you doing in the UK? I mean, you invented public health policy and yet you don't seem to be practicing it. Is there any sense that economists in New Zealand are sort of looking at the UK and other countries saying, why aren't you analysing these things and recognising the huge potential economic impact as well as human suffering of what is happening in terms of the spread of this contagion?
It might strike you as ironic, but I think a lot of the local economic analysis has been rather more critical of our own response, as much as that's been not a bad outcome for us. But you know, the implicit price that's been attached to saving a life, even in New Zealand, is very, very high. And so some economists are wondering, why are we doing this when we could be rationing our resources in other ways? Why don't we shut down our economy and our borders for the seasonal flu that kills 500 people a year, for example? So, you know, it's that sort of, if you're being strictly, purely, rational about it, you would make these very tough comparisons. You know, to then look beyond the way we did it and think about what the various strategies might be around the world and which ones have worked out better than others. I'm sure this is going to spawn great research for many years. One of the problems is, of course, controlling for all the different factors that are different across each economy. But there are various comparisons at a more anecdotal level, obviously, that have been drawn. Island states, for example, with a greater ability to control the borders, it makes an elimination strategy more viable. And so that is begging the question, if you had a choice between elimination and simply letting things spread out in a slightly controlled way, it begs the question why he didn't. And we know Sweden, of course, had the other example of going for a herd immunity strategy from the outset and created its own sort of natural experiment. So we're yet to see, I think, where the jury lands on this. It's quite clear the human cost in many countries has been very, very high. The US and the UK are particular examples, obviously. In New Zealand and Australia, the human cost hasn't been that high. You could argue the economic cost has been quite high all the same. And I think it's difficult for politicians if they are faced with the choice of prioritising the economy over lives. You can see how it's natural to not want to be the politicians that presided over lots of people dying, though it seems that isn't a rule universally shared.
And finally, Dr. Meade, any message that you would have as a New Zealand economist for policymakers across the world in terms of how they should address the issue of long COVID from a policy point of view? I
think two bottom lines are, one, we should be more rigorous about doing our cost-benefit analyses. So this is where policymaking, whether it's in New Zealand, the UK or elsewhere, I think a lot of it hasn't been strictly based on these sorts of, quite ruthless but systematic assessments of what might be the best way forward for society at large. So the first, lesson is, please let's just do that work. And then the second lesson is, when we do that work, please don't just focus on mortality. We need to focus on the morbidity side of things as well, the extra health burden and ongoing and additional social impacts of ongoing illness that could be affecting a very large chunk of our populations.
Dr. Richard Meade from Auckland, New Zealand, thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.
Coming up after the break, Alex continues discussions on the economic consequences of COVID in the longer term. Join us then. Welcome back. As a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, Professor David Blanchflower was one of the first economists to recognise that the inadequate and orthodox response to the world banking crisis risked prolonging the economic misery for millions over many years. So it proved. Now he's focusing on the human economic impact of COVID, particularly in the United States. He explains this latest work to Alex.
Professor David Blanchflower, thank you so much for joining me once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Of course, great to see you again.
Now, we've already seen the acute impact. I mean, tell us in macroeconomic terms, what thus far has been the impact of COVID in the world economy?
The unemployment rate in the United States went from 3.5% to 20% in 6 weeks. So we've never seen anything that hit as quickly as this and as deeply as this. So that was the first thing, a huge hit to the world. And then this thing kind of spread and continued and had big effects on economies. Central banks and fiscal authorities stepped in, but now we're in a recovery phase, and that recovery phase is difficult. It's hard to see what happens as you take away all the stimulus, but this is an unprecedented in terms of its deepness, as well as its speed. So then recovery from it is difficult, and we're still trying to recover, and it's going to take a really long time, but we don't really have much of an historical record to help us.
Well, let's compare the impact in macro terms of the pandemic with the Great Recession of starting in 2010-11. Now, that hits the structural aspects of the banking system. This hasn't done that. Does that mean that if the correct and perhaps the more unorthodox, more challenging economic policies are considered, it should actually be possible in macroeconomic terms to recover quicker from this shock than it was from the banking shock?
Well, obviously there was a major banking shock and that impacted globally. But actually what it didn't do is it didn't stop people from walking about. I mean, I've talked about the economics of walking about. A good indicator, I think, is we know about footfall in Times Square. Times Square in New York City. Well, for a very long time, nobody was walking about Times Square. And even today, it's about 50% of what it was before. So we didn't have anything like that in 2008 and 9. We didn't have people not going to restaurants, not going to shops, not going to cinemas. So it had a real effect on people. And think of people didn't stay at home. I mean, we've had a year of people staying, not flying, not taking buses, not taking trains. So that in itself was a major problem. And of course, think of what happened. Restaurants closed, sandwich bars in London, where people used to get to Victoria Station, they commute in and then they go to their office. Well, no one's been going past that for a very long time. So in a sense, the question is, when this thing goes away, will all those firms that have closed, will they restore themselves? And will people go back to the way that they were before? So I think that's what's different. In many senses, people did go back to the way they were before in 2010 and 11 and 12. The question now is, in the future, are they going to? And the suspicion is they aren't. I mean, the stores that closed, there weren't really factories that closed and stores that closed in 2009. They have now, and the question is, down the road, will they reopen? Will people do things differently than they did before? And I think that's the big difference. I think the likelihood this time around, long-run changes in behavior will be very different than they were pre-pandemic. And that didn't happen in 2008.
But let's look at the human side of recovery and the long-term human effects on economics. I mean, the first of these is very much related to the disease. I mean, just when we thought the vaccines were coming to the rescue of at least the highly vaccinated economies, along come variants, and along comes long COVID, which seems to be affecting substantially more people even than were affected in the most acute part of the virus. What's the economic effect of having a substantial section of the population with a long-term debilitating illness?
The story, in many ways, it's like the story about ME, which is that we don't exactly know what the consequences are, how long this thing will go on. If someone has got long COVID, the likelihood is they're debilitated, they struggle to go back to work. And the firms that I've been hearing on construction crews, they can't get the crews to come back because people are suffering a longer term return, if you like, from COVID. So this is a problem for us. We don't know what to do about it, but the likelihood is that it will have economic impacts. If people are sick or feeling debilitated, they're not going to be able to go back to work in the way that they were able to after the Great Recession. So willing and able to work, but they're not actively capable of getting to the. Maybe what it'll mean is that for many people, they can stay at home and do work remotely. But a lot of it is that with ME, they're exhausted. So these are consequences, I think, that means we have to think out of the box, and to suggest that we can suddenly just go back to a world, December 2020, it doesn't look right. And it means that recovery is going to be complicated and long.
And how about the work that you've been doing with colleagues on monitoring distress, anxiety? Now, obviously, periods of economic uncertainty make people feel anxious, and that's well established. But this pandemic must have a long-term effect on anxiety, as well as the immediate effect of people worrying whether they're going to catch it, whether they're going to be severely ill or die. Well,
two answers to that. The first one, in the UK, we have really good data on happiness. We had a giant drop in happiness in March 2020 in the form that we've never seen. But I've done a lot of work in the United States, and what you see there, two interesting things. Anxiety and depression and worry has risen dramatically. It actually peaked in the United States in the week of the election, and has actually diminished somewhat since then. And particularly worry was true of the people who voted for Biden. But I think there's another part to it, which is actually the young. I hadn't understood till I wrote this paper called Biden, COVID and Mental Health in America. And the answer is actually, I hadn't really quite understood that the young disproportionately are the ones that have actually had COVID. And they're the ones disproportionately who've been anxious and worried about the effects of COVID, but their ability to get a job, to make a step into the world of work. So anxiety, depression, worry, lack of happiness, we've never seen levels like this. In the UK, we've never seen a drop in happiness of the kind that we saw in March 2020. It's recovered a bit, Alex. But again, go back to where we were, go back to 2008. What was interesting is that happiness hardly fell at all between 2008 and 2009. So you ask a macroeconomist, a happiness researcher, what does it mean and where are we going? I really don't know. And anyone who says they do, any Fed president, Monetary Policy Committee member who says they have a clue what's coming, are just engaging with what I call, you'll like this, I call it guessonomics.
Yeah, but you're the pioneer of walkabout economics. Yes. So what do your guts tell you? What do your students tell you about how this anxiety is going to affect them as economic participants in society?
Well, a number of them tell me that the big story I've had from my students is a number of their friends tell me that jobs in restaurants and fast food houses that students traditionally do have become pretty bad jobs. People yell at them, they don't like that particular job. So I think a reevaluation of low-paid jobs, and we're seeing the prices of those rising. But I think it's this great uncertainty, and especially for the young, as I said to you, the young are if you're furloughing people, if you furloughed 1 million people, the firm isn't hiring the young people that come out of school and college. So I think what people are telling me is this thing isn't over. There's lots of adjustments to come. I mean, I'm about to start a teaching we still don't know if it's going to be remote, if I'm going to teach in the classroom. I mean, the story I have is that at Dartmouth, most of the people are vaccinated, 45 people in the class, but there's about a 30% likelihood that somebody, even with all the vaccination, it's about a 30% likelihood that somebody in the class has got COVID. Still, so the answer is, what are you going to do? Are you going to go to the office? Are you going to, what are you going to do? So I think the economic implications are that people are worried and scared, especially the young. And in the United States, in the southern states, this is a big worry. So we've seen a divide coming. The world has now got two groups of people, not Republicans and Democrats, Tories and Labour. We've got the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, and we've never seen anything like that.
Famously, you were the lone voice on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England who warned that without a more adventurous attempt to recover 10, 12 years ago, they would have a long-term impact on the economy, and that's what transpired. What message would you have to policymakers now as they approach these even more complicated questions of how you ensure recovery?
Great question. And there is a precedent. In 1931, Keynes warned, and I've written about it several times, he warned about the long dragging conditions of semi-slump. And he said, it's not about the crash itself, it's about what follows. And the question is, are you going to do sensible things or are you not? So I think the answer is, looking forward, you need to think out of the box. You can't go back to the old methods. You can't go back to, we're against QE, we don't think negative interest rates are a really good idea, and let's get people on their own. The idea you're going to have long COVID and people who are going to take a long time to recover means you've got to try and address the real problems. And I like the idea of address the real problems of the man or woman on the Mile End Road omnibus. The reason I like the Mile End Road is it was named because it was a mile from Aldgate. So it was about, let's think, it's outside the city. Let's think about the well-being of the man or woman in Glasgow and in Edinburgh and on the Mile End Road in London, and try and think about their well-being rather than get to some orthodoxy. And that's what happened. The last thing we need is groupthink. What we need are smart people coming up with new ideas like the Richard Meade idea you talked about. And if you don't, what are the consequences? The consequences are going to be very serious on ordinary people. And that's the concern. And that was the concern in 2008 and 9. But it's even worse now because health and economics are both together in trouble. And the strain on the health service is huge too.
Professor David Blanchflower of Dartmouth College, thank you so much for joining me again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Yes, sir.
In the long run, we're all dead. It's a famous line from England's most celebrated economist, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes did not mean, as is often assumed, that we should disregard the future in terms of economic policy. He was rather arguing that we should not assume that shocks to the economic systems will automatically right themselves once the initial storm is over. And so it is with COVID-19. A whole new branch of economics is developing around the impact of long COVID. While early studies of the pandemic focused on the immediate collapse of world GDP and the medium-term impact on jobs, it's now becoming realised that the biggest economic impact of all may not be on the deaths of 5 million people, but the long-term debilitation of tens of millions more. Long after the acute pandemic fades into memory and the many immediate wounds heal, human and therefore the economic scars will remain. And this goes beyond the recovery impact on the public finances. With creative rather than orthodox economic policies, it should be possible to refill the coffers of government and replenish the public services. However, the economics of human impact will still endure. Long COVID is likely to physically impact on a substantial section of the community and therefore the workforce, perhaps for years to come. The economic impact of grief, depression and anxiety is difficult to measure, but it is very real. In economic terms, COVID is likely to be ever with us. But for now, from Alex, myself and all at the show, it's stay safe, take care, and we hope to see you all again next week.